the panel that we put together today is sort of, we have a bunch of questions that we're going to ask, and we'll have everybody up here discuss some of those questions. And then towards the end, we want to leave some time for your questions, because I know you have a lot of questions, but you're here, so you're interested in this topic. So, with that, here's the panel. I'm going to introduce myself. My name's Michael Scheer. I go by the Pres 98, and I own my own small business, and I'll be moderating the panel today. All the way to your right is Abigail Phillips from the EFF.
I'm a staff attorney at the EFF, where I focus on online content issues. Those are mostly around copyright, but net neutrality kind of fits in there too.
Next to her is Todd Kimball.
Hi everyone, I am basically a small business infrastructure geek and kind of playing the role of the old guy who's been on the internet for a while and asking how things have changed and why is this different than 1994.
And next to Todd is our DEFCON virgin, Deborah.
Hi, this is really loud. Does that work? Hi, I'm Deborah Salons. I'm at D Salons on Twitter. I'm a telecommunications attorney in Washington, D.C., and my practice is primarily regulatory in front of the FCC. I'm supposed to give you all this disclaimer that I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, and I'm here to give you legal information, not legal advice. And the opinions that I'm expressing today are my opinions and not the opinions of my firm or the firm's clients. Thanks.
And this is her first DEFCON, so everybody give her a hand.
And it's my first DEFCON. And my first panel. First everything.
Awesome. Okay, so let's talk. What do we want to talk about here is when I started looking into this issue of net neutrality a year or two ago, first thing I want, you see all these people on YouTube videos, I support net neutrality, or I oppose net neutrality. And I couldn't really find, well, what is net neutrality? And it turns out that that's not, it's easier to ask the question than to answer it. Because, we can break it down to a very simple statement. Say all bits are equal. And I think most people would say, okay, that's a reasonable definition of net neutrality. And that's net neutrality from a sort of, philosophical standpoint. But how do we put that into practice? And putting that into practice is one of the problems that we've run across. And then secondly, why you should care about this issue. So I want to show you a little bit of the FUD that's been out there over the past couple of years. Okay, so this is the one I talked about. This is the net neutrality, all bits are created equal. And this is the most basic thing that you can say about net neutrality, and that content should be treated equally. Okay, I think most people can agree with that on a general concept. Then we have save the internet, save the world. And now we're kind of getting into this like, well, really? Like, if we don't do this, the world's going to end, or what? What's going on here? We have advertisements where companies are, advertising different plans at different levels of content at different prices. And then we have headlines. Some people have said, if we adopt net neutrality, it will be the end of the internet as we know it. And some people have said, if we don't adopt net neutrality, it will be the end of the internet as we know it. And then we have the most extreme case. This woman is named Tanya Devereaux, and she ran for office in Belgium, and she said she would take the virginity of anybody who supported net neutrality. Unfortunately,
we do have the virgin here.
So this is sort of what we're dealing with. Net neutrality, well, what is it? It's all of this, or is it none of this? So what we want to talk about is, let's start off, let's kind of go through each panelist and say, well, what is net neutrality? What is it to you from a sort of philosophical standpoint, and then what is it from a, an actual regulatory standpoint? Anyway.
Well, I could give one thought. To me, net neutrality is really about consumers being able to access the content that they want on the devices that they want. And when I say content, I also mean services, applications, content. Whatever that vehicle is. That doesn't mean to me that consumers might not pay more for more bandwidth, but it does mean that they don't have to pay more, say, to be able to get access to YouTube, as opposed to not having to pay at all to get access to some other video service.
In my mind, net neutrality is, kind of at the high level of just, at each end, not being... Oh, sorry. My concept is just not being double billed for stuff. If you're paying for internet access, either as a consumer or a corporation, or you're paying for that bandwidth at one end, you shouldn't be charged for it at the other end.
Okay, and for the definition of net neutrality for me, I thought this was actually a really interesting question when you posed it to the group, because net neutrality means different things to different people. So I was doing a little bit of research on the internet, and the definition that I felt most comfortable with was no restrictions by ISPs or government on consumers' access to networks that participate on the internet. And for me, as a practitioner, especially an FCC practitioner, when the open internet rules came out, people are calling them the net neutrality regulations, and to me that's very ironic. When you look at it, and we'll get more into that later in the panel, but those regulations are actually promoting net neutrality, but when you take a step back, you're like, wait a minute, the government is actually getting involved, and this is the first time the FCC is actually, they've been attempting this, but it's one of the first steps that the FCC is trying to regulate the internet. So to me, I know it means different things to different people, but I think it's no restrictions by ISPs or by the government.
Absolutely. I think one of the interesting things about net neutrality is this community, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. I don't want to put labels on the community as a large, but this community is generally libertarian in the fact that we're skeptical of the government, we're skeptical of government actions, we're skeptical of government overreach. Yet, let me backtrack. How many of you think in principle, not necessarily in practice, how many of you think in principle that treating traffic equally is a good idea? Net neutrality in general is a good idea. Okay, most of you, and I think, how many of you trust the government to enforce it? Okay, so this is what I'm getting at. We have a principle that we mostly all agree with, but we want the government, maybe or maybe not, we want the government to enforce neutrality, and I don't know if that's a good idea. I'm not saying yes or no, I'm just sort of posing questions. So, right, so his comment was, do you trust the government more than the ISPs? Because they may not want to enforce net neutrality, and we'll get into that. So let me give you a little background on the first, let's wrap up the first section. There is no agreed upon definition of what net neutrality is. Comcast and Verizon will tell you something that the FCC commissioners will have a different definition than you or me or anyone else up here. So net neutrality is a concept, but in practice, what does that mean? For example, do you want your ISP to block spam for you? Well, is that a net neutrality violation? I don't know. We'll talk about stuff like that later. So in this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the government and the FCC and enforcing net neutrality. So back in about 2007, the government or the FCC enacted some net neutrality guidelines. And how many of you remember the issue where Comcast was caught throttling BitTorrent traffic? Most people remember that, yes. Yeah. So the FCC took Comcast to court, and it turned out that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals said to the FCC that your guidelines, you don't have the power to enforce them because Congress has never given you the authority. So what we're talking about here is an issue of Congress giving an executive branch agency the authority to do something, which they had not done at that point. So while Comcast violated the FCC guidelines, the court said that the FCC didn't have the power to enact those. And that's sort of the environment we're in now as a post-Comcast, where the FCC's authority is not really clear. Since then, last December, the FCC has enacted a new set of net neutrality regulations, and some people are questioning, do they actually have the authority to do that? So let's talk a little bit about the FCC's authority to regulate the internet in general, and where might they find authority to regulate in net neutrality regulations?
Well, I will say the FCC in its most recent order that it issued December 23rd last year, they claimed authority to regulate using a very similar theory. I mean, it's the legal underpinnings are sort of arcane, but a very similar theory to the same one that was rejected by the DC Circuit earlier. So it seems pretty unlikely that the court, because the order is sure to be challenged. In fact, it already has been, but then the court found that challenge was premature. It's sure to be overturned again. It does not seem like the FCC is going to successfully find authority under the Communications Act as it exists, using the kind of theory that they're using, which is that it's not the internet is not regulated as a common carrier under Title II, but rather through ancillary jurisdiction, and that's jurisdiction that Congress has given the FCC to regulate anything that's sort of related to other things that it has definite authority to regulate under the Telecommunications Act.
And I kind of want to bring in the English side of all of that. The FCC is involved with this. For those of you who might be kind of new to this internet thing, past 10 or 15 years, the FCC is involved because the internet branched out from shared networks 40 years ago that were all on AT&T. This was all telco territory. So for years and years, any internet traffic, long before there was a web, was effectively regulated by the FCC because it's all on these public utility lines, and things shifted in the 80s when AT&T was broken up, and now that we have providers like Comcast coming in and Google owning all this dark fiber, so it's different from the old telco lines, as well as all the wireless stuff. That's one of the things that makes this problem different than maybe things were in '95 when the web started, and we saw similar sort of kind of restrictions on how you access data.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on some of the stuff that Abigail said. What the FCC is claiming for their jurisdiction is ancillary jurisdiction, and it sounds like a lot of legalese. But just to kind of give you the background on this, Congress, opponents of the open internet order would say that Congress hasn't given FCC express direct authority over the internet. So to give you an example, in the Communications Act, Title II is on telecommunications services, Title III is on broadcast and wireless, and Title IV is on cable. There's no title for internet, and the internet hasn't been classified as a telecommunications service. So there hasn't been any direct mandate from Congress saying, yes, you can go ahead and regulate this. What ancillary jurisdiction is an overarching statement, as Abigail said, in the Communications Act that basically says the FCC may perform all acts, make such rules and regulations, and issue orders not inconsistent with this chapter and may be necessary in the execution or functions. So it's just an overarching thing saying, Congress might tell you to regulate telecommunications, but you have a little bit more leeway than exactly what Congress says. But they're taking it a little too far. At least that's my opinion, and I think that's the opinion of most people.
So I think what you hear, and I think we kind of all may agree on this, that whether you support net neutrality regulations or not, the concern, at least among the panelists, and I would say myself, is that maybe the process is not working out so well. In other words, as an executive branch agency, the FCC can only do what it's authorized to do by law. And even people in Congress, many people in Congress who support net neutrality are telling the FCC, maybe you need to back off a little bit because we haven't given you the authority to regulate that. So I think that's a process concern in terms of what the FCC is doing.
Actually, can I add one other thought? I mean, one of the concerns, at least to me, with the way that the FCC is going about this is if what they ended up doing was merely regulating net neutrality or regulating I mean, apparently regulating net neutrality, that might be okay, but the theory that they're using is so broad that it seems like it would really give them sort of unbridled ability to regulate the internet generally, and that's really scary. So even if you think net neutrality is great and you totally want regulation that would ensure that, you don't necessarily want all the other collateral damage that could come from the FCC deciding that it's going to start doing other things. And I mean, we've seen the FCC in the past try to regulate indecency on the TV, for example. Would not want to see that happening on the internet, for sure.
Yeah, so if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Or they can keep using this justification to do other things.
Exactly.
I think one of the other, and obviously I'm not the lawyer, one of the other provisions that the FCC maybe secondarily is relying on is there's sort of a deregulatory provision that the FCC is supposed to try to get out of the way to promote broadband. And that they're sort of using that as a regulatory rather than deregulatory.
Right.
Yeah. Whatever.
Yep. They're charged with promoting broadband or information services throughout the country, and I think they're piggybacking on one little thing that Congress said and saying, oh, well, that means we can regulate the internet instead of something that's very broad, just to make sure that people. To make sure that the information systems continue to go forward.
Excellent, yes. Okay, so net neutrality definition, not really sure. Definitely concerns about the process and whether the FCC is sort of exceeding their authority. On this next slide, I have a number of what the press or whatever, some people have talked about as potential net neutrality violations. So what I want to do is talk about each one of them and then have the panel maybe discuss what they think about it. Is it a net neutrality violation? Is it something that potential net neutrality violations should take care of? The first one, which I already mentioned, is the Comcast and BitTorrent traffic. So if you remember back about 3 or 4 years ago, I think the Associated Press had done an investigation and some other people had done an investigation and found out that Comcast was inserting reset packets into BitTorrent traffic so that the torrents were slowing down or not completing. And this, I think, was probably the first big media look at net neutrality in terms of a violation. So let's talk a little bit about what Comcast did. Does that violate sort of the principle of net neutrality? And is there a way that net neutrality regulations could fix something like that? Well, let me start off with myself. I'll say that I think what they were doing is certainly a violation of the principles of net neutrality. I mean, they're sort of interfering with traffic, interfering with the protocol. I don't know that regulations could fix that, but let's see what the rest of the panel says.
Just to back up one step, just so that you know what the open internet rules say right now is what the regulations are. Basically, the net neutrality rules, there's 4 principles, and one is transparency. They want network operators to talk about their practices and their management of their systems and give consumers information about what they're doing. Internet services can't block legal content, and the next principle is no unreasonable discrimination. So therefore, if you're a cable company like Comcast, you can't just say, I'm going to block Netflix just because. And an overarching principle, which is the 4th principle, is reasonable network management. So an internet provider can actually do some things that's within reason to manage their network, such as security. Spam. So I guess with the Comcast BitTorrent case, these principles came after that case, but before the case, there were some principles that were very similar to it that the FCC was relying upon, and it was a policy statement, it was not regulations.
Right.
But what the Comcast and BitTorrent situation, what the courts and what the FCC was focusing on was reasonable network management. And was it reasonable for Comcast to be blocking the BitTorrent stuff? And they didn't disclose it.
Right.
So one of the things that's in there that Deborah didn't go into is this applies to legal traffic, which when we're talking about BitTorrent should be brought up because a lot of stuff that people do for BitTorrent could be although maybe not criminally illegal, there could be civilly illegal.
Yeah, actually, I want to add to that point. It's really interesting to me that the FCC rules don't actually necessarily prohibit, or they create loopholes that might have allowed what Comcast was doing. And that's interesting because FCC, of course, tried to go and stop Comcast from doing it. The rules say no unreasonable discrimination. It's not clear. I mean, there's a specific section in the order that says you. While it's not forbidden by the order, pay for prioritization is probably not okay. So you look at that and you say, okay, well maybe then Comcast couldn't do what it was doing. But there's also a loophole in there for any reasonable efforts to address copyright infringement. So if Comcast had merely said, oh, well, this was our reasonable effort to address copyright infringement because we happen to believe that, a certain percentage of the traffic or a large percentage of the traffic on BitTorrent is copyright infringing, then it actually might have been okay under the FCC order, which is, I think, one of the significant loophole concerns.
I also think interesting about the four principles that she said is that both the third and the fourth one use the word reasonable. And I talked about this in my previous talk on the Fourth Amendment, which has the word unreasonable. Is that what does that mean? Reasonable is, and I use this. I don't even know who the quote belongs to, but it's been said that reasonable or unreasonable, it might be the most litigated word in the history of America. What is reasonable and what is unreasonable? And two of the four principles use that word. So certainly, these principles they're interesting, but they're destined for the courts.
Sure, and actually in the Open Internet order, the FCC specifically says that with reasonable network management, it's going to be case by case.
Right.
Like they give some examples as to what that could be, but they say it's case by case. So it's not defined.
Right.
And that's going to be a problem.
So in this case, it's like obscenity. And as far as these regulations, how do other things tie in, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act? When you're talking about doing reasonable things to prevent illegal activity, and the other laws that are in place that are could be controversial, and the things that big corporations effectively have for shutting down traffic.
Yeah, I mean it's a great question. It will encourage certain behaviors that might be overreaching or overbroad in terms of stifling traffic and activity where the law might otherwise actually provide some protection.
Question.
Wow.
Several. First off, the point about reasonable, unreasonable, legal, illegal. Once you define legal, then everything else is illegal, which is great because they can make anything they want legal as long as they think of the kids. And then everything else is illegal. Second, reasonable. It's like, and unreasonable, it's like being a little bit pregnant. I mean, let's be honest here, that's what they're saying, okay? Third, those were statements, forgive me. Third question, why the hell are we talking about it? And my question is this, we're talking about just American net neutrality. A significant portion of internet traffic is outside of our borders, outside of our control, outside of the FCC, and we have the arrogance to think that we control it all. Fascinating. What do you think about it?
Wow. Well, I didn't do a lot of studying up on the international views, but I think that it's more open across the world. But one of the things that I did see in the FCC order and one of the dissents to the net neutrality rules, one of the commissioners brought up the fact that, look, America is a leader in the internet and in innovation with the internet. Well, that's what she said. That's what she said. Okay, that's what she said. If they're gonna, if the FCC, this is in the dissent, if the FCC is going to go ahead and regulate this, what kind of a role model are we serving to other countries? Because that could be dangerous too, because then they have their own rules, and where are we going to be then?
I mean, check me on this. In South Korea, they get, 100 gigs to the house?
But the point you raise is a good one, and that is, what we're talking about regulating is only part of the internet.
Yeah.
The traffic that's in the United States. What about traffic from Europe to Japan, and how does any of our stuff, can we regulate that traffic if it transits the United States? Even if it's not,
At B-Sides, and forgive me for mentioning it, but we were handing out zero bank cards. And the zero bank cards gave you $400 worth of free VPN out of Iceland, Germany, Japan. You have a dozen different choices, including the US, a couple of them. But I mean, so now that traffic is going encrypted across and gone, and how does that affect net neutrality? I mean, so as more and more people go to encrypted VPN traffic, how is that going to affect, or is the legislation going to give a crap about it? And that's another question.
Let me just walk through the rest of these violations, and then we'll start, we can start talking about them individually. No problem. How many of you have mistyped a domain name, and instead of it just not appearing correctly, you got your ISP search page with maybe some advertisements, right?
I long for the days when that brought up porn sites.
So Verizon has done this in the past, and there's a lot of ISPs that do this now. You type in the wrong thing, and instead of just not resolving and giving you an error, you get, maybe you were trying to search for this, or maybe, and it's a certain, well, some people have suggested that your ISP, by doing this, is sort of messing with the DNS protocol, and that's a net neutrality violation. Let me walk through these all.
Well, actually, I want to speak on that really quick.
Go for it.
I've got some strong feelings on this. This all started out in 2005. VeriSign, who effectively owned the domain name system for years, rolled out this concept where if you typed in something that didn't resolve, they brought up the ad pages. And at that point, because they owned it, and well, because they owned the infrastructure and any DNS stuff had to go through them, I was firmly against it. That was breaking DNS. DNS might be a sketchy protocol. Dan is always talking about it. He's in track 2 or something right now. But it's one of those things. They were breaking it. In this case, well, you're getting a service from your provider, and if they're going to redirect it, that's kind of a contractual thing. You can use other DNS providers. You don't have to use the one provided from you. I know I haven't for years. So,
I agree with Todd on that one. I have some problems with it. I think it requires some transparency that may solve the problems. I don't see it as a net neutrality issue. And partly I think it's nice to keep those net neutrality issues discrete, because there may come a day when there really is some kind of regulation. So let's only affect.
Right. And you sort of mentioned the devil's advocate argument, Todd, which was, if you're a Verizon customer, you don't have to use Verizon DNS server, right? You could use Google or OpenDNS so maybe it's a technical, I don't know. I mean, you could argue either way.
Well, let's expand that to other services beyond just a DNS. Say you don't get it so much anymore, but it used to be you got an internet account, you had an email account that went with it. I mean, the concept of, all right, I've got an email address, and I had a PacBell account for 15 years. I paid $20 a month. I didn't connect to them just so I could keep that address and people connect to me. How would those sorts of things, it opens a whole just big can of worms when we start getting into those services that are available elsewhere. When you get beyond just kind of the physical infrastructure, that's kind of what the limitation is with a lot of this. And that's my feeling on, okay, if we're going to look at the net neutrality, we need to look at kind of the physical nature of it and those specifics.
Okay. A while back, Xbox Live started providing ESPN3 streaming over Xbox Live. It turns out that some ISPs like Time Warner were blocking it. Has anybody had this problem in the past where you had Time Warner or another ISP and they blocked ESPN3 from Xbox Live? Okay, maybe a couple people. We'll skip through this one just because.
What do they show on ESPN3? Is that the dwarf tossing?
I don't know.
No?
I don't know. Okay, does anybody have this is I'll only do this if someone actually has a phone. Does anybody have a Samsung Fascinate? A Samsung Fascinate cell phone? One person? Only one person? Okay, this was another issue that people mentioned. The Samsung Fascinate phone, which the search engine was locked to Bing. And is yours locked to Bing? Okay. That was another issue. Can your wireless provider lock you down to using a certain search engine, and is that a net neutrality violation?
About 10 months.
And then last one I want to mention, and then we can talk about any of them, is Metro PCS. Metro PCS is a wireless carrier in Texas, and they provided a couple different 4G plans. One was like a $40 plan that gave you sort of internet and YouTube. And then if you paid $50, you could have access to like Skype and what else? Netflix and some other things. So what they were doing was charging more for different types of content, which I think, as a principle, most people would think that that's a net neutrality violation. Charging people more for using based on the type of content.
And I actually like to discuss that a lot because it goes back to years ago. You go back to the beginning of this fancy web thing, and in '95 you had your options. You could have your AOL. In my case, Netflix was the first Netcom, first company that came up with a flat rate actual web plan. But you pay less money and you get a shell account, or you pay a bit more and you can actually use a web browser, and you didn't have to do links and stuff. And so, looking at the historical concept, these are similar things. I don't know whether it's good or bad. And then my feeling, I'm not the attorney here, is I've gone back for years on the common carrier clause, and I always thought that was a good thing. I mean, that's kind of the original net neutrality thing, and that basically, from my perspective of managing networks, has been, all right, if I have the capability of filtering certain content and I filter that content, then I'm responsible for what's passing on my network. I mean, the internet is based on a lot of sharing, and so you let other people's traffic pass on your network. If you are filtering that traffic, you're responsible for it. So the kiddie porn comes across your network. If you're not filtering it, that's fine. It's not yours. If you are filtering it, that kiddie porn, you own that kiddie porn, and it's, you're going to federal pound you in the ass prison. And so that's why I'm a fan of kind of the common carrier stuff, which we're kind of losing with things not being telcos and the, infrastructure changing and the legal wrangling stuff.
Well, I guess one of the things out of all these, the net neutrality violations that I think we should point out is in regards to wireless with the new open internet regulations, wireless is treated differently than wireline broadband services, and the Commission gives a little bit more leeway to wireless services because they feel like they want to be a little bit more hands-off since it isn't as developed, or so the FCC says,
Right.
As a technology. So with the 4 principles, the transparency, the blocking, the unreasonable discrimination, and the reasonable network management, wireless companies have to abide by the transparency rules. The blocking, wireless companies have a little bit of a different standard than the wireline companies.
Right. I believe that in the wireless standards, they can block as long as they're being transparent about it. Is that correct?
They cannot block, they can't block lawful websites, and they cannot block applications that compete with the provider's voice or video telephony services. So therefore, if you're a mobile broadband provider, you can't be blocking someone else's VoIP service.
Right.
So in the arena where they actually have more authority, they're doing less, basically. Because the wireless spectrum is totally regulated by the FCC. There's no question about that. And it's also those are fall into the category, at least as far as I know, of traditional telcos. Right. So, on a couple levels, they have way more authority versus just the standard internet these days, but they're doing less.
I mean, I guess what's going on with these rules is one of the arguments against these rules is let the market do this, let it play out. And so the FCC is like, well, the wireline broadband's been around for a while, the market's kind of done its thing, we can go in and regulate it. And as far as the wireless goes, we'll regulate it, just half as much as the wireline. We'll keep an eye on it, and we'll see how it works out. And they don't want to stifle any innovation there, yet these regulations don't stifle innovation in the wireline. So it's it's kind of funny that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy that distinction.
Yeah.
I mean, plus, like, if you want to increase competition, which in theory they do, wireless is the area where we have none of that. And particularly if this AT&T T-Mobile merger goes through, I mean, there are going to be 2 companies that own 80% of the market. I mean, it seems to me that wireless is maybe where more would be valuable.
I mean, it needs more, in my mind, it should have more regulation because it's a far more, limited resource. The spectrum's already been sold, so there should be more regulation because you can't have more competition because, well, it's not like I can go out and it's tough to buy, a hard line, but theoretically, if I wanted to run over to my neighbor's house and throw some Cat5 over there, it's fine. But the wireless spectrum is totally regulated and it's sold, so you can't really buy much more.
Yeah, I mean, there's another interesting issue there, which is tethering. Verizon had recently asked, I don't know, some app, either Android or Apple to take tethering apps out of its app store. And there was a complaint that was filed alleging that that was in violation of the openness rules that govern that particular spectrum that Verizon was using. I mean, separately, just the question whether tethering is a net neutrality issue, sort of an interesting one. I'm not sure what I think. I mean, I think tethering should be permitted, but I think the question whether net neutrality goes from content to device is interesting. The FCC thinks it does. For what it's worth.
We have about 15 minutes left, so we want to save the rest of the time for your questions. The only thing I ask is that you just try to make your question brief so that we have time to get to as many people as possible. If we run out of time, we can spend some time in the question and answer of room, but we want to get as many questions as possible. Go ahead.
Mostly it's two brief statements / questions. First, going back to one of your previous statements where you were discussing the actual service provider regulating the services. If it's per the legal aspect, how are your big three, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, how are they actually able to be blocking Skype if there's actually a law or regulation saying you're not allowed to block service provider?
So how are they blocking Skype if there's a regulation saying so? Well, these regulations aren't in effect yet. They have to be published in the Federal Register, and then there's going to be 60 days, and then after that they will be in effect. So, I mean, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, Abigail, if that's my understanding.
Yeah, but I mean, they will surely be challenged, and so it could be a very long time, if ever, that we actually see them implemented. So right now, there's nothing.
Right, right, and unless there's, my understanding is unless there's an official stay and the court grants the stay, the laws will come into effect 60 days afterward. So, but if somebody challenges the rules, which they're most likely going to, Verizon tried to challenge the rules and the court threw it out saying it wasn't ripe because it wasn't published in the Federal Register yet, then I'm sure someone will stay the rules, and who knows when.
Seems likely.
Yeah.
And the way they're written, if it's my network, I can come up with total legal justification for throttling any traffic I want to. So, it's you have good attorneys and you have good justification, and okay, Skype is causing, unwarranted consumption of bandwidth. It's unequal. I can't provide the service that I'm contracted to do to provide all of everyone. So that's the loophole I'd go with if I wanted to pull that off and it was my network.
Right, and just to add to that, if I'm Verizon or Comcast and I pay to put the infrastructure in, then I might claim that. Well, I paid to put this infrastructure in, so why can't I have some reasonable control over what's on it? So it's a good question. I think what goes to the heart of it is, like you said, the regulations themselves, whether the force that they have, because they're going to be challenged, and whether or not because if an ISP blocks that stuff now, there's not really, because the rules aren't in place 100% yet, there's not really an enforcement mechanism in place.
Okay. The second question kind of goes more towards the copyright aspect. When you look at things in the past, such as Microsoft, when they came out with, I believe it was either Vista or 7, and the European Union actually stated you are not allowed to force your browsers only to IE, and they made it so that you had to offer the services through IE, Firefox, Chrome, etc. At the same regards, can't that be taken with net neutrality? You're regulating your services based on Samsung Fascinate locked to Bing, Verizon locking you down to using their certain services, Comcast, all your ISPs are doing the exact same thing. How are they varying as far as their legal regulations? How are they different than Microsoft going out here and doing the same thing with their browsers?
Well, that would be another way to attack some of the perceived problems that come from net neutrality, which is to take an antitrust perspective and say, let's try to increase competition here, and maybe that'll improve some of the problems the fallout that we would see from not protecting net neutrality per se.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 10 minutes, so let's try to limit it to one question per person so we can get through all of them.
Thanks. My name is Josh, and I'm from Seattle, and I appreciate and respect the panel, and my impression was that most people are pro net neutrality. And in the interest of getting both opinions out, I'm just wondering if you guys could elaborate the opposing argument about, in my opinion, why isn't my dollar, my vote enough to actually cause this to affect a change? I worked at a small ISP, a couple small ISPs with less than 10 employees, and generally we had people come to us because we didn't have any kind of regulation on our network traffic, and I'd like to hear why that wouldn't work in the case of certain service providers, throttling different services and people being unhappy with that and going to other ones. Thanks.
My feeling on that is the last mile stuff is a limited commodity, and for a while with DSL it was open. I know in California that was turned around so that for a year or two there was unbundled DSL, and you can still get DSL through other providers, but then another ruling came through and said, oh no, if you want to have DSL, like AT&T can charge you for that, and that at that point it's kind of the last mile sort of a thing. It's who owns the lines, and if there are tariffs in place so that there are reasonable rates for other competition, I think it's great. I don't know whether there is anything like that for things like cable, and that maybe someone else can answer that.
I'm not sure. I mean, there's less.
Yeah, and that's because the government funded a lot of the telephone lines being put in, 100-ish years ago, and so and that's a public utility sort of a thing, so they were able to regulate that, which is how the FCC got involved. The cable stuff, they own all of this. So you take a look at Google with all the fiber they have. Who knows what's going to happen the next 5 years with Google? There could be a whole free second super fast internet here, 100 gigs to your door, that totally avoids all the rest of this stuff. You just have to let them sniff all your bits. And I'm scared of Google, but since I know where they sleep at Burning Man, and when that changes, then, I'll stop using them.
Hi. This isn't my primary area, so I was just kind of hoping that maybe you could answer a question. Do you know if there is a push on either the congressional level or the international level to provide regulation in the net neutrality, or to expand the FCC's delegating authority, or is it just going to be a court battle going out on a case-by-case basis at this point?
There's been a push on both sides, meaning the Republican side and the Democratic side. So the Republicans are trying to get a bill through Congress that would say the FCC can't regulate this. The Democrats are trying to get a bill through saying that they actually have explicit authority to, but maybe bound that authority.
And do you know if there's anything on the international scale, just given the international nature of the internet?
There's some international net neutrality regulation. I think Chile has some laws. I think the Netherlands does. I think Japan does.
I meant more like on a treaty scale, like everybody working together to try to regulate.
Not that I'm aware of. I think it was mentioned in one of the recent EU Commission reports, but not positive.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just to add that to I didn't hear everything she said, but generally speaking, Republicans are opposed to giving the FCC power to regulate the internet, and Democrats are generally speaking. And because the House is controlled by the Republicans and the Senate's controlled by, I don't think in this congressional session that we'll see Congress give the FCC any additional authority.
Right.
And
even like 3 days ago when they were dealing with the whole budget crisis, I saw some press about some of the Republican senators were, I think they sent a letter to Chairman Janikowski of the FCC saying, you guys need to review these rules because President Obama came out with some kind of speech saying that all regulations that have been passed or are about to be passed, you need to make sure that they're efficient. And they're saying, hey, you guys have to look these over again. So I know that the Republicans aren't very happy with what's going on, and there is definitely some pushback there. But whether or not it's a priority for Congress, it might be a matter that the courts get a hold of it first.
Okay, so you guys started a lot with content filtering, but it seems like from an ISP standpoint, they're not filtering content because they don't like YouTube or Netflix. They just don't like the bandwidth suck that it is. And for reasonable network management, yeah, you can throttle some services to give priority to others, but then all bits aren't equal. How are the regulations going to propose the ISP standpoint of overselling their bandwidth? They offer everybody X number of megabits, but they really don't have the capability to give everybody X number of megabits all at the same time. So if you start using all of your bandwidth, then they look at you and they ask you, okay, what are you doing with your traffic, and can we shut part of your traffic down because you're creating a problem on our network even though you are only using the allotted bandwidth that we told you could have.
I think I might be able to answer this. In the FCC order, as far as reasonable network management goes, they say that congestion can be legitimate, reasonable network management. So, I mean, I think, and I'm not a technical person, it sounds like there might be some kind of congestion issue.
Well,
It seems like they oversell bandwidth like airlines oversell flights.
It's been happened with cable from day one where things are oversold. And unfortunately, I don't know. I've looked through this briefly. I haven't read the whole 180 pages yet. But when it comes right down to it, I don't know that that's really addressed. And I hate to say it, it's kind of one of those contractual things where, you know, there's the last mile thing. So we don't really have the competition on the cable side. And, you know,
not
that's
just cable. I mean, wireless ISPs.
with wireless, and on any of
Data
that.
plans first
it's-
came out, they were unlimited. Now
We-
they're turning
we are
profitable
being
because
cut
people are
off,
actually using
so-
them.
All right, okay.
We can finish this.
We can,
We're-
for those of
Come
you,
join us
for those
in
of
the,
you who haven't asked questions, please come to the question and answer. Thank you to everybody on the panel for coming today, and thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.